It's a strange world that we live in, and the future isn't what it used to be. We've always had such an infinite capacity for creation and compassion and joy, but also for rage and cruelty. You see, I think your life and everything is a non-linear system. We understand linear systems, cause and effect, positive correlation and negative correlation. The problem with a non-linear system is that the interactions quickly become too complex. No one remains one person. And what if a conversation could change the way that you think about yourself and the world? And what if everything that you held to be true was somehow, in some way, wrong? I'm Dr. Mark Halloran, and you're listening to Deep Trouble on 94.9 Main FM. I suppose I was thinking in terms of when we're talking about ISIS and we're talking about, I suppose, their narrative with Dabiq. The seizure of that town was really important. And when they lost it, they sort of had to underplay it then, because there's prophetic literature and a prophecy built into that, isn't there? And I was just wondering the legitimacy of that prophecy of the final battle, the last judgment around that town.
Sure. I covered this topic in my lectures, theology classes.
Okay.
And there's a whole lecture on that and discussion that takes place. When you look at all of these like reports attributed to Prophet Muhammad that talk about end of times. Like some of them are quite extraordinary. Like for example, he says in one hadith, he says that people will race with one another in building tall buildings.
Right.
That's definitely happening today.
Right.
Interestingly, it's happening in Dubai and
yeah, I've been to
Saudi
Dubai.
Arabia. And they're racing
There's
with
the Burj Khalifa.
And he even says the desert people will race with each other. And some of them are quite extraordinary, and then the others, most of them come in cryptic form that
Right.
open to, like it seems symbolic, and it needs interpretation, and even within that, sometimes there's contradictions within those. If you take it literally,
Yes.
there's even contradictions within those sources. So there's really, like some scholars, Muslim scholars say that they should be interpreted, just like you interpret Quranic verses as well.
Right.
Like for example, you get this the Antichrist or Dajjal. It will be one-eyed, and then he'll be 70 meters tall, right? Like, okay, how does like a Godzilla kind of being, right? Imagine that kind of a being walking around.
So you're saying this is allegorical, obviously.
Scholars say, like one scholar says, for example, the size is indicative of his power.
Right.
And even he says, like you see, the Japanese emperor was projected in a picture with 1 foot in Europe, 1 foot in Japan.
Right.
As this giant person on a globe that kind of represented the power of the emperor.
Yes.
So you could conceivably argue that that Antichrist will be powerful. The one eye kind of may mean ideological, like looking at it only from one perspective.
Yes.
Rather than a broad perspective. Like there are more other interpretations than this, and sometimes may even certain stories, because storytelling was very common.
Yes.
In the early history, when there's no like TV, you have entertainment was storytelling, and these storytellers usually exaggerated certain stories. Like that one-eyed giant seems, I used to hear that from my grandmother. In every story there was a one-eyed giant that had to be killed.
Yes.
Now,
Well, it seems it's very similar to the prophetic ideas from like John on Patmos and the Book of Revelations. I thought that was what was interesting, was that there's in I don't know whether it's Greek or Aramaic, but they talk about the valley of Tel Megiddo, which is translated as Armageddon, and so Christians, particularly in the US, evangelical Christians, are looking forward. Tel Megiddo is an actual physical place as well. I think it's in Palestine or somewhere.
Yeah, I'm not sure. But can I just conclude this saying that, because I think that what Muslim scholars need to do is look at the authenticity of these narrations.
Yes.
Muslims did that for centuries. Like there's hadith scholarship, hadith criticism,
Yes.
where you look at the sources, you look at the narrators, and that you can actually find something weak, strong, authentic.
Yes.
This maybe should be looked at a bit more, scrutinized a bit more.
Right.
And if they're found to be authentic, and then that still there's a room for interpretation.
Right.
And even interpreting that, we should not be very sharp in the way interpret. What if you get it wrong?
Right.
And then imagine like ISIS was wrong, for example, right?
Yes.
It thought that it was going to bring. It was wrong.
It was fulfilling a prophecy.
Exactly, and that fulfilling prophecy also means that they are supported by God, supported by Prophet, and they get an aura of religious legitimacy with that. Again, religion is used in a utility. So I mean, there are even like not just ISIS, but other normal Muslims. They interpret the events around the world, that what's happening through the prism of these narrations, and I always warn them, saying, just don't be too sure about your understanding of these sources. What if you get it wrong? Then your faith will be shattered. And
well, that is a good point. You're setting yourself up for disillusionment, I suppose, in your own religion.
Disillusionment in your hopes about the world, at the least, but even it could shake your faith in religion itself.
I wanted to come back to you to talk about, there's a chapter in your book between modernity and tradition about the role of women in Islam. And you talk about that essentially historically and I suppose right up to the present day. So I was wondering if you could, talk to some of that, because one of the points that I think that you made, which was really good, was that there are a lot of Islamic countries, and there's a lot of practices within Islamic countries which are considered to be maybe retrograde in relation to women's rights. But also you noted that there are lots of Islamic countries that have had a female head of state, and Turkey is sort of the success story, essentially, the moderate success story.
Okay, I'm not too sure about Turkey, unfortunately, regressing a little bit, but hopefully that will be temporary.
Yes. Regressing in what way? Because
in political sense, economic sense. Now, I just want to say, Islam, my book, Islam Between Tradition and Modernity, my main emphasis here is that whatever topic you look at,
yes,
there is a gap between what we call tradition or scholarly tradition, the Islam that we get from the books that are written by celebrated scholars of the past, and what we are seeing in the Muslim world today. There's a gap. And I think this gap needs to be explained first. And the gap is largely caused by, firstly, Mongol invasion. Crusades has an impact, but not that much. But Mongol invasion was far more destructive. Almost the entire Eastern Muslim world was invaded and destroyed by Mongol invaders. The city of Baghdad was, in 1258, was captured and sacked. The entire city, libraries were destroyed. There's a house of wisdom in Baghdad that was a center for learning and science, and developed massive library, that was destroyed, and Baghdad never recovered from that. And there was a Black Plague in that at the same time, with decimated, populations. And then Muslims recover from that in 15th, 16th centuries, but the kind of societies they build is not the same as well. It was still very advanced to compare to today, and compared to the Europe at that time. Europe was still in dark ages. Like Muslims were like the West, or in the past, Muslims were so developed and seen as the most developed and most civilized
Yes.
In the world compared to that time.
Yes.
And just like today, when we look at the world, we say everybody wants to live in Western countries, right?
Yeah.
Most economically developed, politically stable, and freedoms and so on. You can do art, commerce, everything. You had that in Muslim countries and civilization.
That's what we have talked about in terms of. I would just say that we've talked about, and this was essentially my take on it, and you don't have to agree, but it was that when you're reading the Quran, you're reading specific surahs around relationships to women or women's rights and things like that. Generally, you point out that there is within the Constitution a whole section around security for women and the idea that if you're a good man, then you're taking care of women. That's a decree by the Prophet Muhammad. But you might find surahs in there, but by today's standard, you would think this is quite suppressive of women's rights or whatever else. But surely you're only judging something on a time and a place. Because I remember one of the readings that I read while I was reading the Quran was around the pre-Islamic customs of burying baby girls alive because you didn't have the resources to take care of them. When Islam came in, they overthrew one of those practices. That seems like a very good thing. It was
prohibited, yeah.
Very progressive thing, but it seems to me unfair to weigh a text against the ideas of a particular culture today.
Look, let me tell you, at the time in 7th century, in much of the world, having daughters was seen as disadvantageous because you needed males were more like they could work, they could fight, and so on.
The environment was different.
Yeah, the Prophet Muhammad, he said, if anybody raises 3 daughters properly and then marries them off, they will go to paradise.
Right.
Like he puts raising of daughters to a very high pedestal. That's so important. I met Muslims even today who they have just daughters.
Yes.
They say, I'm so happy having daughters because of that saying.
Yes.
Now, I'm not saying, they're going to feel bad if it wasn't the case, but everybody wants, people may want boys and girls for different reasons. Now, and he also has a saying, he says, the best amongst you are the ones best in conduct, behavior. And the best of those are the ones that are best to their women.
Right.
And the word in Arabic is women.
Yes.
It says their women. Sometimes they translate it just to say in brackets wives. But the Prophet doesn't say wives. There's a word for that as well. He says your women. And so he puts the treatment of women as a criteria, or the best treatment as a criteria of best conduct and a proper Islamic society.
Yes.
Now,
so progressive, incredibly progressive, very similar to, I suppose, ancient Sparta in some ways. Women, in ancient Sparta, women could fight with men if they chose to, so join the army. Women could own property, maybe not to the same extent, and they could drink, which was a big thing in Sparta. The same thing, very similar in terms of not the fighting, but in
not
terms
the
of
drinking part.
Not the drinking either, but in terms of Islam, very similar. So there was ability to own property, although in some sense I get that that might have been part of pre-Islamic culture because Muhammad's first wife must have owned property. She was a widow, but I suppose in terms of we talked about.
It was very different to the rest of the world. That especially in Judeo-Christian world. Now, I just want to say that like,
Sure.
Ken Armstrong says that in medieval times, the Christian thinkers and theologians used to criticize Muslims for giving too many rights to women.
Yes,
Now,
absolutely.
I just want to say that because I'm not trying to be apologetic, but to show that Muslims were very at a high level in their treatment of women,
Yes.
and the Europe was behind. And what we see today is that, in a way, Europe sort of caught up and
Yes.
surpassed in their treatment of women,
Yes.
whereas in the Muslim world we digressed,
Right.
we went backwards. And there's a big shift in 19th century, like in the poor treatment of women in the Muslim world.
Right.
And that coincides at the same time as colonization of the Muslim world. Now, a lot of people have written about this, like when, I guess, when men lose their power in society,
Yes,
they
that's
exert
true.
their power at home,
Yes.
and that kind of reflects on their kids and women. Or even colonization was so destructive that it removed all those cultural habits, customs that were there, that protected women, looked after them, and then it was replaced by something modern, and it was a concoction.
Yes.
So Muslims went backwards. Not in Islam didn't go backwards.
Yeah.
Muslims did.
So in their understanding is what you're saying. You're making the distinction between the religion and the understanding.
Yes, and then the Western world improved dramatically.
Right.
And by the way, a lot of the changes that happen in the Western world is in 100 years. The World War I, World War II was very dramatic in the way that women could work.
Yes.
And then even the invention of pill liberated women and so on. There's a lot, it's very extremely recent, a lot of the developments.
Yes.
And Muslims are kind of catching up, or they're trying to catch up. But I'm just saying that this is not fault of Muslims, and I think when we compare Muslims with Western civilization, we need to compare apples and apples. So if you want to compare the best of Western civilization, which we
Yes.
have now in Australia, and if this is the best what we have, we need to compare that to what the best of what Muslims had,
Yes.
and then compare and see if there's any gaps or whatever criticism you may lay.
Well, we talked about some potential textual problems in terms of the religious texts themselves within the Quran. And I know we talked about Surah Al-Nisa, 434. We've already spoken about that in the previous interview, so we don't have to really labour the point about that. I feel as though we kind of, like I said, I have my own view that this is like any kind of text. There are certain things that even as a religious person you might say that's interpreted as a time and place. So my example is in Leviticus in terms of prosecution of people for being homosexual. So you find two men in a homosexual act, but I think you need two witnesses, and it has to be tried by the Sanhedrin. Well, the Sanhedrin hasn't existed for 2,000 years, so it has never really been tried. And it's not even sure how often it was, if ever, tried before that, because the principles that you need to lead up to that are so difficult that whether it actually...
Sure.
But the point I did want to talk to you about was this. So in Surah An-Nisa, not the point that it leads into, but it starts off with, men have authority over women because God has made one superior to the other, and because they spend their wealth to maintain them. Good women are obedient. They guard their unseen parts because God has guarded them. As for those who fear disobedience, admonish them, forsake them in their beds and beat them. And it changes, like with softly or with... That's not the point we need to talk about. Then if they obey, take no further action. Surely that as a verse in modern times, anywhere in the world, is problematic in terms of its interpretation. Men have authority over women because God has made one superior to the other.
Yeah, it doesn't look good. Like when you look at it from the Western paradigm.
That's taken out as well. So I mean, when we talk about this, there'll be a second part of the question I talk about.
Sure.
Yeah.
But I'm not shying away from. I mean, I'm happy to go in detail of that verse.
Yeah.
I just want to lay out what I said earlier. How do we approach texts like this?
Yes.
In my view, as I laid out, my approach method is look at them in their own right without taking in what we have today,
Sure.
women's rights, and whether that sounds bad or not. Just look at and see what it's trying to say to us in terms of, and then once with that understanding, look at it today.
Right.
I'll give you another saying by Prophet Muhammad, which is not Quran but Hadith. He said, if a man and a woman should not be in the same place, in a covered place together, like they should not be alone in a room, let's say. And look, if you look at this, we can say, oh, how backward is it? It just doesn't give space to women and so on. Because we bring with it our modern paradigm into reading that text. But now, for example, things have changed after the Me Too movement, where a lot of corporate men, CEOs and managers are saying, I'm never going to sit with a woman in the same room alone again. Because
they also encounter quite a lot of criticism for that as well.
Yeah, they do, but you can see why they're saying it, right? Because they don't want to risk themselves for accusation of sexual harassment, because the laws are today such that if a woman claims to sexual harassment, you have to believe her, and unless it's proven.
Well,
I'm not saying these things are right or wrong.
No, I wasn't going to say whether you said they were wrong. I was going to say that I don't think the law does do. I don't think the law does do that. It's still. See, the laws are generally, I'm not a lawyer, but I've got a friend who's a lawyer, they're crimes against the state. So if it was a serious sexual assault or rape or something like that, when it's prosecuted, it's a crime against the state, not against the victim. And they're trying to sort of change that, and they're changing the way that the evidence is gathered and how you can cross-examine the witness and all that sort of thing.
But if there is a doubt, or if it's about his word against her word,
you're talking about the social...
The bias is towards... it's better to err on the side of the woman than better to err on the side of the man, and then the matters are taken, and more significantly, the victim, let's say a woman, is kept, her identity is not revealed, but the identity of the accused is revealed, and that destroys their career.
Yes.
Even before, we saw it with, what's his name, in Australia, the actor, what's his name?
John Jarrett.
John Jarrett. We saw in his case, he was exonerated, right, by the courts.
Yes.
But his reputation is destroyed.
Yeah, so that's a separate thing. There is an issue in terms of the court of social opinion now, because people have so much access to it. But
look, I don't have strong views on these things, but I just merely raised it because when the social context changes, then all of a sudden this advice that you get from the Prophet Muhammad seems really appropriate to at least some men. Right. But I would go actually further and to say that that saying protects women. You can look at it from that. You can say, if there is a situation like a man and a woman are together in the same room, and that it's a patriarchal society, there's more chance that the woman would be harassed, and that men can get away with it. This is what happens in Japan. There was a documentary about that. So the Prophet basically is saying there, when you look at it in its own right, and then with the context, we kind of see the wisdom in that, what he's saying. That's what I'm saying. So I'm saying that we should approach these texts because without really not be judgmental about it initially, and let's read it in its own context and look at it as, is this saying something? What is this saying? Maybe with well intention as well. Is this saying anything about protection of men and women, protection of rights? Because in my belief, Quran is ultimately there to protect the rights of people.
Right.
Like when you really read into its ethical and legal guidelines, which is not too many, like you would probably say, strictly speaking, Quran has 70, 80 verses that are strictly legal.
Right.
Maybe if you extend that to 700 verses You could include the principles that operate as well, out of 6,238 verses. Right?
Yes.
So Quran is largely a theological book, and its concern is more giving a message to human being about their salvation on earth and in afterlife, and
Yes.
having said that, it needs to be read in its own right, and I think when you do, when I read the verse, chapter 4, verse 34, from the perspective of what is this telling me about rights of men and women? Because Quran itself says, men have rights over women and women have rights over men.
Right.
In other verses.
Well, this says though this specific. And I hate to kind of.
No, it's okay.
But I'm just saying that it seems a difficult one to interpret, and I would say that, like most religious texts, in terms of the way that scholars approach it, is that there's going to be massive contradictions across the Gospels and the Torah and things like that, and then they say, well, let's look at this verse might say that, this verse might say this. What's the weight of evidence? But it seems like it's a problematic verse, because people would say that it underlies some of the things that you see in theocracies like Iran and the treatment of the Taliban towards women and things like that.
Definitely verses like this could be used to justify abuse of women.
Yes.
I definitely agree with that.
Yeah.
But I don't think that's the intent of the verses, though.
Right.
If I believe that this verse is revealed by God,
yes,
certainly God's not going to choose between men and women, and
well, it depends on your mindset, doesn't it?
It depends on the human's mindset, not God's mindset.
Yeah.
So that's why I look at all the advice that we get. Like when I studied, the key thing that we were taught in interpreting the Quran is you don't engage it with what you intend.
Yes.
You need to search for the intent of the Creator.
Right.
And the Creator does not distinguish between His creation.
How do you feel as though you get to the intent of the Creator?
Well, by removing your own subjectivity. With that, obviously, you never know what the intent of the Creator is.
No.
And you have to engage with the text in that. But that allows you, that forces you not to be as objective as possible. Now, in that keyword, let's take the keyword qawwamun, which is translated there with 4 or 5 words in the translation you got. It's just a single word.
Right.
It does indicate to be kind of like one step ahead, to be strong. It really means to be strong.
Right.
Now, let's go back to society, 7th century once again. A hunter-gatherer society. Like humanity lived in hunter-gatherer for hundreds of thousands of years.
Incredibly harsh environments.
And there the man has to... I understand that the word kawaman to mean that man is not intrinsically superior to woman, but man should be in a marriage, in a marriage relationship, man should be a step stronger to give stability to the family. Actually, we know that women prefer men who are emotionally strong, and they actually choose women that have that kind of display strength in terms of partner, marriage, whatever.
Yes.
Because a woman could be the biggest fear of a woman is harassment.
When we talk about strong, I think people talk about that. Well, it depends on the researcher and the research, but they talk about competence and things like that.
Well, in our time, that reflects in terms of competence, but in agrarian societies, it meant that men could fix things and he can go and work. Sometimes in jobs that he doesn't like,
yes,
and come and provide for the family, which was the harder job.
Yes,
and women had a difficult job as well. They lost their kids and so on, a lot very often. But both genders had difficulty. But in terms of it was little bit more. Like the Quran is not saying absolute or men are so superior beings that they outshine women.
Right.
Just a degree stronger.
Right.
And I read that as men should be like that, or they should try to be like that, for the benefit of the family, for the benefit of the relationship. I mean, you may disagree with that once again from the paradigm of today's gender, politics and
Fourth
gender
wave
paradigms.
feminism.
Yeah, all those third wave, fourth wave feminism.
Yeah.
But I personally see in that a lot of wisdom.
Right.
And the way I explain that verse when I explain it this way to men, Muslim men, they say, yeah. They all of a sudden feel like a man, and they feel responsible.
It's a positive thing.
Yeah, that's
responsibility.
They feel
like
responsibility, which comes naturally to men, to provide, to protect the family.
Yes.
And obviously, that kind of responsibility also brings with it some certain rights.
Yes.
Just as women, they fulfill very important role in a relationship and marriage, and they have rights.
Right.
So in that sense, I don't see anything wrong with that verse,
Right.
if you understand it this way.
Yes.
Obviously, if you understand it to mean, we men, we do have, we are born, we're born with far superior things.
Yeah.
We would be mistaken.
Right.
I personally think, actually, this is one of my, I'm thinking of working on a new work, and I've got 3 project ideas, and one of them is gender theory in Islam. We don't have a proper modern gender theory in Islam.
Right.
And a kind of gender theory that, once again, applies the method that I'm talking about. A lot of the material that we get today is either influenced by traditionalism or even feminism. There's a lot of feminist thought.
There's feminist Islam as well, isn't it? There's feminist Islamic thought.
And Muslim women are quite feminist.
Right.
And maybe rightly so, because they have suffered under traditionalism, or they continue to suffer some of that.
Yes.
I support them for that. But when we talk about Islam, or Islam says this,
yes,
we have to be very careful, and especially interpreting the text. I feel that there should be a serious study of proper gender theory should be developed with a proper methodology.
Right. How many of the texts that we've talked about contentious texts, but are they affected by Quranic abrogation, or is that something that is applied by every scholar? Or is that I've heard that that's quite contentious anyway?
The idea of abrogation is debated. There are books written on that. Abrogation meaning some verses in Quran abrogating the others.
Or older books as well, like the Gospels and the Old Testament.
Yeah, that's a different.
That's a different abrogation.
When we talk about abrogation, Muslim scholars understand Quran abrogating itself.
Right. Yes.
Because especially if there are different verses on the same issue.
Yes.
Which one do you apply?
Yes.
And,
well, we talked about the Christian, like Jews and Christians being saved thing, and then within a verse I read the sort of something that felt like the opposite.
Yeah. My take on that is there is. You can talk hours on abrogation, and scholars differ. Some scholars said there's no abrogation in the Quran. Some said there's as little as 5 verses. Some talked about a few hundred verses.
Right.
Who's true, right? Who's correct? My take on it is that in theology there is no abrogation. You can't change truths. Like if there are truths, truth is truth. You can't change it. But in terms of legal and ethical things should not be abrogated either. Ethics is also somewhat universal.
Yes.
And the only thing you can abrogate is practices.
Right.
And even policies and practices. Even those, I would say that Quran doesn't abrogate, but what happens is that there's a natural, as I maybe said right at the beginning, when you read the Quran from your lens, certain things come at you, certain things kind of go to background. So there's a natural filtering that takes place, which is sometimes risky because, again, if you do it as a scholar, You got to be very careful in that. But
There
if
are
you're doing
obviously
it,
rules.
not like if you, as I said, for example, the verses about interfaith dialogue, for example, when you read it, let's say a Palestinian in Israel or in West Bank,
Yes.
he's going to read Quran, he's going to bypass those verses
Right.
because it doesn't apply to him. His condition is different. His land is occupied. There's a lot of apartheid-like, treatment of. So, I mean, it would be silly to say let's have dialogue. But whereas for Muslims living in Australia, we're peaceful. Everyone has rights. We're part of society. We're accepted as part of this. But we follow different religions. There's a need and a very large space for dialogue.
Right.
So those verses jump at me more as a Muslim living in Australia, the verses that talk about dialogue.
Right.
And those are teachings too. Those are revelation too.
Yes.
Like, why would you choose one over the other? Why would you choose conflict? And so I guess this is why the Quran, when Quran talks about the revelation to Prophet Muhammad, it says, we've given you book and wisdom. Like, book is revelation, wisdom is the ability to correctly understand that and read the time and the context you live in and apply that revelation correctly for beneficial and good and merciful outcomes. Ultimately, if something is, an interpretation is leading to ugly, unfair and incompassionate outcomes, you've done something wrong, in my opinion.
I think this leads into the next question, one of the areas that I really wanted to talk to you about as well, which was the new atheist Sam Harris's conversation with Omar Aziz. And the basis of this conversation, which has been called the best podcast ever, I think, is around Sam's assertion that you can trace all of the negative behaviour or even attitudes within, he talks about concentric circles of the Muslim population, to the text themselves, and that is all. And so it ends, he talks about bad faith, like arguments in bad faith. I think Sam develops quite a bit of bad faith in this particular interview. What do you see what do you think the problem is with this? I know what I think the problem is with this, but what do you think? What do I think?
Yeah.
Well, it's a bit in terms of what he talks about. I'll listen to what you say first, but I'll talk about it's a bit technical in terms of his argument, but I'd be interested in what you think about the problem with sort of placing all of the ills that you see in relation, in some form of relationship to Islam, like Islamic extremism and or violence against women, or extremely punitive laws within certain theocracies and things like that, back to just the texts themselves.
Yeah. But we know that that's not a new claim. Somehow it's just using the same old Orientalist claims that has been written for the last 300 years, which has been revitalized since 9/11 to some extent, that the argument is there's something inherently wrong with Islam itself. If Muslims try to be religious, they become worse rather than become good.
Yes.
So the problem is with religion, and if Quran and Hadith are the religion, the problem is with those texts.
Yes.
I hear this all the time, and the easiest way to this is what Omar Aziz did actually. He exposed Sam Harris.
Right.
In an essay that he published, and Sam Harris had to respond to that because Omar Aziz's argument was very powerful. What Omar Aziz was in the essay, what he was saying was, Sam Harris knows absolutely nothing about Islam other than He hasn't studied it. He is not well read in Islam.
Yeah.
Just reading some articles here and there, quoting some verses and using his analytics, his own mind, his own processing in his mind, and he's an articulate person and has got a podcast. He's just articulating those well.
Yes.
And to an audience who's even less informed than him, that will sound correct. And that's what Sam Harris is doing, and that's what Omar Aziz exposed him. Right. And actually, even before Omar Aziz, not in relation to Sam Harris, but there's a book which is very important, I think, Islam Through Western Eyes, written by Jonathan Lyons. And in this, Jonathan Lyons, his main argument of the text is, he says, since the Crusades, there's always been certain individuals and social groups and institutions who have benefited from a negative portrayal and perception of Islam. And that engagement has been a monologue with Islam rather than a dialogue.
Yes.
And Sam Harris displayed this in that podcast really well. He wanted to have a monologue. He wanted Omar Aziz to read his essay and then stop, and where he would then respond.
Yes.
You wouldn't even, Omar Aziz says, you wouldn't even expect that from your professor to tell you to read your essay so that he can mark you on the spot.
Yes.
So it was very condescending, which is it's typical of that attitude. And Sam Harris is benefiting, or people like him are benefiting from a very negative perception of Islam. If you write a book which critiques Islam, you'll be held on the pedestal, it will be a bestseller. Even our Imam Tawhidi, or I'll call him Mr. Tawhidi, the so-called Sheikh who was very controversial in Australia, he's now going around in the United States and being treated like royalty.
Right.
He's getting TV shows, he's getting interviews, he's getting an audience.
Because of a critique.
Because he's becoming extremely critical.
Right.
Because this audience, they don't know better, and they're also prepared to accept these things as true than what I'm saying.
Right.
Mine is analysis. Mine is what Muslim scholars write and talk about how they understand Islam.
Yes.
So it's not going to get a good audience. Well, thank you for doing this podcast.
I can't guarantee you a good audience.
Yeah, but I'm not sure how it will be received. But at least we're talking now.
Yeah.
So Sam, look, I also do this exposure myself. Once I was invited to talk about Sharia with another Australian person, I won't mention his name, and I looked at his online material. He was extremely critical of Islam. He was doing exactly the same thing, selectively quoting certain verses from the Quran, and it's always the same set of verses and same sort of hadith. And then the whole panel was about Islamic law. And what I did was I went to that panel with a book written by Imam Shatibi. Imam Shatibi is a 14th century Muslim jurist who wrote about higher objectives of Islamic law.
Yes.
And in my opinion, that should be of a student in Islamic law should read that book first.
Yes.
And I just took that book and said, if anyone who hasn't read this book shouldn't talk about Sharia at all, because they won't know what they're talking about.
Right.
And that person was at the back foot in the entire panel discussion, because I exposed his ignorance immediately without being rude.
Yes.
Now, in another context, another public forum, a man got up very polemically. He said, I read all the hadith and all the verses in the Quran, and it's full of violence, and it's against women and this, that. Mehmet is lying, and he's apologists.
Yes.
And then my response to that was, well, sir, if you have read the entire Quran and entire hadith, can you please tell me one good thing that you saw in those sources? One good thing, please.
Yes.
With a quotation as well, please.
Yeah.
Nothing, absolutely nothing, because he hasn't read it.
Right.
Most
I
of most
mentioned a couple of things
yeah,
earlier, so I saved myself.
yeah, well, you can read, but
Yeah.
there's a difference between the claim that you're an expert
Yes.
to claim that I have read about Islam, I'm informed. You can say you're informed, maybe more than average person,
Sure.
but to claim that you're an expert and then debate with an expert,
Yes.
say to an expert that he's lying, is a massive dishonesty.
Yes.
And this is what's happening.
It is a bit insulting.
It's insulting, and there's dishonesty there because the claim for expertise is not there.
Yes.
So this is exactly what Sam Harris is doing, and in a way, Sam Harris is getting away with it because bashing Muslims and Islam is acceptable. And I saw this in Sam Harris's discussion. It wasn't a debate with Jordan Peterson.
Oh, yes.
They have a very popular,
Debate
I think it was
series.
in Vancouver and Dublin, and I watched all of them, and I was really interested in what they had to say. And in both of them, although it wasn't done badly, but in both of the cases, they always give as a bad example from Islam, both of them.
Oh, right.
And because if they're critical of, let's say, if Sam Harris is critical of Christianity, Jordan Peterson is going to really snatch, and maybe the audience, half of the audience. And
that's where they find common ground.
If they have critical of Judaism, it'll be labeled as anti-Semitic.
Yes.
But talk about Muslims, Islam negatively, no one's gonna defend Muslims.
Well, I should be pointing out that Sam Harris has been critical of Christianity. He's written a letter to a Christian nation. He's an atheist. He seems to have fixated on Islam, and I think that's because it does. I think to some extent it's about the way that your audience reacts in terms of what you then choose to continue to speak about.
But can I just finish?
Sure.
Sorry, I was really surprised and saddened by even Jordan Peterson, because he called Prophet Muhammad warlord and Islam being archaic religion.
Yes.
And he also said, I respect Jordan Peterson a lot. I like him in a sense.
What do you like about him?
But can I just finish what I'm saying? But he also says, people who speak publicly should have responsibility. The idea of responsibility is very strong in his discourse. And then he makes, and he also says, if you don't know something, you shouldn't speak about it. And then he admitted that he doesn't know much about Islam.
Yes.
But then he labels Prophet Muhammad a warlord.
Yes.
And the impact of this is that millions of people who watch him, they're not going to go and check whether Prophet Muhammad is a warlord or not.
Yes.
They're going to believe it because Jordan Peterson says so.
Right. Well, I mean, that's why I'd be critical I would be careful in terms of my criticism of anything, because let's say the Gospels, I don't speak Aramaic, I don't read ancient Aramaic or Greek or Phoenician or whatever else it was written in. And so my knowledge of it is amateur at best. It would be an amateur interest, and I think that's the issue with the way that people are approaching this. Sam's a neuroscientist. He's an atheist, so I understand that he's critical of religion. I think that's fine to be critical of religion. I think the problem in this particular interview is the thinking and the argument. And so he gets quite elevated. Omar doesn't really acquit himself very well. He's not really given much of an opportunity to, because it's almost like Sam just wants to dictate what he wants to say. He wants him to admit that the text is the sole cause, that this is what causes. And so he uses an interesting phrase. He says that this, whatever the surah is in terms of violence, or the one that I quoted before in terms of women, this is necessary and sufficient. And it can't possibly be, because he will often talk about Muslims and talk about even progressive countries and say, well, this percentage, it might be a majority percentage, 70, 80%, would support some sort of violent action against someone who insulted the Prophet Muhammad. But if the texts were necessary and sufficient in a scientific sense to cause behaviour like terrorism or violence, then every Muslim who ever read the text would behave that way. They may be necessary, because if you don't have the text, then you don't have something that you can read that you might translate or mistranslate depending on your view on it. But so it's necessary, but it's never sufficient. And so Omar's point about it being a combination of culture. So we know in Turkey, Islam was interpreted differently, or this is what I've read, and women's rights were significantly different coming into, from tradition to the modern age, because the culture was different where Islam went in, and so it was interpreted in a slightly different way. Politically, the politics of Iran and the way that the Ayatollah operates, or the way that political leaders and despots operate, that's going to affect the people and the way that people react. It's never going to be one thing. That's a massive oversimplification.
Sure. The biggest argument of modern atheists are like Sam Harris, Richard Dawkins, Christopher Hitchens. It's all people of religion do bad things. That's the prime argument they have in their books.
Yes. And
Sam Harris is just using the same thing, and he does attack, other religious traditions as well. They have a point. If religion is supposed to make you a better person, why would you get out of the religious people these fanatics? But I would put that to not the text. I guess his mistake is to extrapolate that to the text rather than the human.
Well, solely to the text.
Solely to the text, yeah. It's really a human element in there. Like there's a strain in humanity that likes fanaticism or conservatism. And Jordan Peterson talks a lot about this, order and disorder. There's that human archetypes, and you'll always have fanatics in any society, in any religious and by extension, whichever worldview, ideology, or religion is dominant in that society, it's going to reflect into that religion.
Yes.
So the main thing is to moderate that by the text, by interpretation of the text, and by the cultural norms and so on. And this is exactly, even the Prophet himself saw this. Even in his time, some of his followers were going into extreme in their religious practice. Somebody fasts all day and one's always nightly vigil. One of them wanted to be a celibate. He actually calls all three of them and says, look, my way, or the Islamic way, is I fast sometimes, or sometimes I eat, I sometimes pray at night, sometimes sleep, and I have a wife,
Yes.
This is my way. If you don't follow this way, you're not one of us. Like, this is very clearly, it's laid out in the text, the hadith text. If Muslims read this, or if Sam Harris puts the time in to read it properly, he will see that Islam and Prophet Muhammad was against, more extremism.
Yes.
And even Muslim scholars defined extremism in both ways. That there's a negative extremism, there's a positive extremism. Negative is extreme lack of something. Positive is extreme of something else.
Have the criticisms, though, from groups like the New Atheist in any way been useful?
Certainly. I was just talking to a student of mine yesterday. He was asking me exactly about Sam Harris. I said, it's interesting, we might talk about this tomorrow.
Yes.
And then he's ringing me 3 times. Finally, I returned his call. He was having a debate with an atheist, and he asked me whether his argument was correct. I personally think all of this is useful, as long as it doesn't become violent and or impinging people's rights. Like, Muslims should be able to live in this society
They shouldn't
as
face
citizen.
vilification or
They shouldn't be.
bigotry.
They shouldn't be vilified.
Absolutely not.
Like, you can disagree with Muslims, and the Muslims should be, peaceful citizens of this country, try to contribute and try to understand Western civilization. I mean, just as Jonathan Lyons said, like there are groups and institutions in the West that stands to benefit from a negative impression of Muslims. I believe that the opposite is also true, that there are certain groups and institutions that benefit from a negative perception of the West.
Right.
I even met Jonathan. We had a discussion. I said, I would love to see if the same thesis holds for Muslims. My hypothesis that it does.
Yes.
Because we see a lot of evidence of that where
So the
West
view.
is demonized within Muslims.
Yes.
As if the entire Western world is out to eradicate Muslims.
Right.
And this is with the Danish cartoons, for example.
Mm.
When the cartoons were first done, there was no reaction. Maybe some condemnation from some theologians and things. That's all.
Yes.
But when it came to the attention of politicians in Muslim countries, they really rallied that anti-West sentiment, and that's why in Pakistan they were protesting in front of U.S. embassy and burning, effigies of the president. When it was in Denmark that the cartoons were published,
Right.
nothing to do with it. But
So
but that was
confusion in the anger.
not confusion. The rhetoric of these groups and politicians, or various groups, they feel they made it an anti-West element.
And you feel
the
like
whole cartoons.
there could be a positive thing to an anti-West.
No, I'm saying that Muslims are also suffering from the bias against, just as perhaps Islam and Muslims is seen from a biased lens in the West.
Yes, they're also saying
West is also seen from a biased lens by Muslims.
yes,
and that we need to be more balanced in our approach.
Yes.
And try to remove subjectivity and focus on facts, and then analyze those facts properly, rather than with conspiracy theories. It's really these conspiracy theories that lead to violence. I read Brenton Tarrant's
Yes.
manifesto, 76 pages.
Right.
It's full of conspiracy.
He travelled around Europe.
He did. His main claim is that we're not having enough births.
Crusader.
We're not having enough birth in the Western societies. The birth rate is very low. We're running out of white races, diminishing, and then these migrant Muslims are coming, invading by migrating, having lots of kids, and over time, Western society is going to disappear, and these Muslim hordes are going to take over.
Yes.
That's whole. And therefore they should be stopped.
Yes. So
Not only they should be stopped, but the politicians, the Western leaders who, in his view, have the wrong policies.
Yes.
He really wants to reverse those. The Muslims again are byproduct, and an easy target.
Well, I spoke to Stephen Croucher, who wrote a piece directly after the Christchurch shootings about the rise of white supremacy and essentially the politics and psychology of hate and how it develops. And so there are really no easy solutions in terms of that, but it really does come down to breaking down barriers between communities working with each other. Because, I mean, whenever people are coming to a country, in this case it's unusual because he didn't live in New Zealand, so he'd come from Australia to perpetrate this in New Zealand. But a lot of his distorted thinking had come from the internet and from echo chambers and things like that. And the answers to this aren't straightforward.
And unfortunately, there's a fine line between an ideology and violence. First people become converted to an ideology, and then not everybody who holds that ideology will end up, being violent, but
yes,
some people will be radicalized to the extent of becoming violent. And this is what happens with Muslims or Islamic radicalism. It's not a religious thing. It's mainly political. There's an ideology of why are Muslims, as a narrative, why are Muslims suffering in the world? Who's responsible for that? And what's the solution? And these ideologues blame it on the West, the puppets in the Muslim countries, and they say dialogue doesn't work, peaceful means doesn't work. It's
Yes.
just a trap. The only way to address this is violence.
Yes.
Similarly, I fear, like I was actually warning about violence towards Muslims because the Islamophobia is also a narrative.
Yes.
And unfortunately, people like Sam Harris are contributing to that, even to a level where I wrote a piece as well after Christchurch bombing in ABC Religion and Ethics, where I argued that before the white nationalism or white supremacy was a very fringe ideology. There wasn't a narrative, but online ideologues like Sam Harris, who really articulate well, they speak well, they close that gap between that ideology and the narrative, and that gives a narrative and a conviction to a very big, large number of people online, and some of those people like Brenton Tarrant, who has issues with, he's an incel,
Yes.
Involuntary celibate, he looked that way, and the evidence points towards that.
Right.
Well,
Dr. Peterson's very, very sympathetic to incels, so.
Well, he is, yes, he is, and but there are social forces out there that in our society, in Western societies, that produce the incels.
Or just produce people who are isolated and alienated, angry. I suppose going back to Islamophobia, because I read your article, an article you wrote a while ago for the conversation about the rate of Islamophobia that you'd been researching within Australia, and I wondered whether you'd talk about some of the details of that.
Yeah, the Centre for Islamic Studies at Charles University that
Yeah.
I lead has published a report in 2017 that analysed 243 cases of actual Islamophobic incidents, online or in real life, that was reported to a register, that was Islamophobic register. Like prior to this report, a lot of the discussion about Islamophobia was, it exists or it doesn't exist, but it's a sentiment. Even if it exists, it's a negative sentiment about Muslims and Islam.
It's just a bias, essentially,
Yeah.
a negative cognitive bias.
But this report showed that it's not.
Right.
It actually leads to action,
Right.
or towards Muslims, abuse or discrimination, abuse, and the next step is violence, and we saw that with the New Zealand shooting. But there's a lot of expression of violence in those, especially online. Like for example, in our neighborhood, a Muslim childcare center opened, we should go and burn it.
Right.
Like this is online comment.
Yes. Well,
and a lot, again, these things were dismissed when you go and talk to authorities and police. They say, oh yeah, look, these people are radical and they're just a fringe. It's always dismissed. It was always dismissed. Whereas if a Muslim talks about, hey, here's a school, maybe we should go and bomb it, and he'll be arrested and put in jail for life, perhaps.
yes.
For terrorism charges.
Yeah.
So the terror laws, it looks like it only applies to Muslims.
Well, yeah, I suppose in the level of white nationalist terrorism but like incident rate, if you don't count 9/11 and things like that, is far more frequent as far as I can remember from what Stephen Pinker talks about. I suppose the history in terms of Australia of white nationalist attacks would be, it's where you develop the sensitivity, isn't it? So we had Bali with the bombings that Australia was affected by that, and that affects the country sort of psychologically.
Oh yeah. I understand why
but
we have these laws, but again,
It's
the
asymmetrical,
laws
is your
don't
point.
say, Muslims should be, if they're caught this we should. It's very generic. It applies to everybody.
Yeah.
The laws are articulated in that way.
It's asymmetrical, is what you're saying, in terms of the fairness of it, the application.
The application is asymmetric. Like, would you, for example, consider the mosque massacre in New Zealand a terror act?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, even Brenton Tarrant said call it terrorism.
Yeah.
It's a terrorism. I want to terrorize.
Yes.
He says it in his manifesto.
Yes.
But very, but he's being charged for mass murder, not terrorism. And also, I really feel.
Well,
And
one
I'm
of the
saying-
laws within New Zealand in terms of terrorist charges at all, there might not be any.
Well, he should
legislation.
be extradited to Australia.
Yes.
Like why was Australia after Paresh guy and all these other guys who went to ISIS? Let them fight and die or whatever. Why do you want to extradite them to Australia? He was arrested in Turkey
Well, it's very
because Australia wants to
Yes.
trial them under terror laws and persecute them.
Yes.
Why
Yeah,
don't we do the same thing with Brenton Tarrant? He's an Australian citizen.
Interestingly, they have the opposite. I don't know, essentially.
But what I'm saying is,
I'm
if
definitely
we
agreeing with you in terms of asymmetry.
I think this is extremely important
Yes.
to show honesty, legal honesty, and it's an opportunity to give a message to Muslims that what we say about like criticism of Muslims or this bad contact extremism is not about Islam. It's about the acts that are done, and we got to catch these people, lock them up. We don't have anything against Islam.
Yes.
Well, there's an opportunity to show that in action in the case of Brenton Tarrant.
Yes.
Like if Australia, in my opinion, says terrorists are terrorists, we don't distinguish between the act and whoever they are, they will be equally trialed and sentenced, and it would send such a strong message positive message to Muslims in Australia.
Sure.
That I feel that opportunity is being lost.
Yes. Well, I suppose the legal jurisdiction could be different in terms of the war in Syria and foreign fighters and things like that in terms of the way that works. I know that the decisions are completely reversed in terms of the brides of ISIS and children. Australia is just revoking citizenship.
That was
It doesn't
good.
want to trial
That
people.
was good, yeah.
It's in fact dangerous to trial people accused of terrorist acts, like in wars on Australian soil. From what I've read, is because some of the actions may have been occur at an ASIO level. In terms of, so the Secret Service needs to know the evidence that you're trying to collect may not be able to be produced within a court of law, and so you can extradite someone back. This is not the case of Brenton Tarrant.
There's a lot of evidence there.
There's a case of, that's not the case of Brenton Tarrant, but the danger of extraditing a foreign fighter is potentially dangerous, soapboxing and them coming back and then.
But Australia attempted to
yes, I know that, which
others,
is interesting. I think.
And there was no qualms about trialing. There are 30 guys in jail at the moment.
Yes.
Charged with terror charges in Australia.
Yes.
And some of them just had telephone conversations and exchanged messages, and there was some intent displayed in those messaging
Sure.
of a terror act. Fine, you catch them, you jail them. We all want to live in a safe society. I don't want, any small or large terror act happen in Australia.
Sure.
Actually, I pray that it doesn't. But again, if a guy commits a similar act, another person that he himself accepts it as terrorism, why are we going out of our way to call it less than that?
Well,
I'm just questioning the.
I'm not sure
reasoning.
whether they. I think in terms of the global media coverage and the way that it's discussed at a societal level within Australia, the legal jurisprudence within New Zealand, that's a completely different matter. But certainly, as far as my sense of it is that it is considered to be, a white nationalist terrorist attack.
Okay.
Because I think of because of the information that came out of where he'd trained and the way that he'd gone about it, essentially.
Sure. But it would be wonderful if Australia did recognise and extradite him and trial him with the, I mean, I don't know exactly how laws apply, but I'm sure there is grounds, really good grounds for that.
Yes. I did want to. There were so many things I wanted to talk to you about in terms of Islamophobia and the definition, essentially. How we define this and the concentric circles that both Omar Aziz and Sam Harris talk about in respect to both sides of radicalisation. But we're running out of time.
Yeah. No worries. Next time.
Maybe next time. Thank you so much for joining us, Mehmet, and I've really valued There were some issues that came up in the interview that I just conducted with Professor Mehmet Ozalp that need to be addressed. There may have been some factual errors. According to the UN, the Taliban and its allies were responsible for 76% of Afghan civilian casualties in 2010 and 80% in 2011 and 80% in 2012. They also were noted for committing acts of cultural genocide such as the destruction of the Buddhas at Bamyan. The other error that needs to be addressed is the error in relation to what we said about the conviction of the Christchurch shooter, Brenton Tarrant. According to the information I have, currently charged with 51 counts of murder, 40 counts of attempted murder, and 1 count of terrorism. So we had a conversation where Mehmet said he wasn't charged with terrorism or a terrorist act, but he has been charged with 1 count of terrorism. Thank you.